Hey, so I visited the concepts in the previous videos of initially, I believe, capitalism, oligarchy, and nationalism, and how these things, in conjunction with each other, are problematic for society, for a functional and stable society, and need to be checked and or eliminated either in part or in whole. And that's the conclusion I've come to thus far, based on everything I've learned in my university and before that, and in personal life, just in general. So now we've got that out of the way. We can hopefully revisit these things in more detail, and I can hopefully go and gather more. I'll hopefully have more time to do some more research and gather official evidence, other than just anecdotal stuff that I remember or can cite off of memory. But for right now, I'm trying to focus on the pragmatic arguments and the ethical arguments more so than, and maybe just the theory itself, more so than trying to just cite every cite everything. Like, I'm not doing a formal legal case per se. I'm going to leave it up to the person who's watching the video to kind of decide. Towards that end, this video I want to make a little bit more succinct, and I know that's pretty hard for me, but I'm gonna try. This video is going to be centered primarily upon, I have a little list here. It's going to be centered primarily on the ethics of capitalism. And I say it with air quotes because I personally do not believe that capitalism genuinely has ethics in the way most people want to interpret ethics as being at least in the benevolent variety. I've actually studied ethics, and the main varieties or types that I've come across in the past are there's virtue ethics. Essentially, you do good things to learn what is good. You do service to generate virtues, and essentially, through these actions, a better society is formed. You learn what is good and bad. Ethics is essentially primarily focused upon what is good and bad, or if there is a good and bad, and why. And then that's hopefully backed up by evidence from metaphysics, which is the greater scheme of how we think everything falls together in some cosmic order. For the old variety of ethics is morals, and they're often used interchangeably, but I make a distinction that morals tend to have a little bit more of a religious undertone to them than ethics do. Ethics are more, I would argue, secular version of what morals typically are, and morals are also likened to virtues in the old sense of the Greeks and what we can, or even there's there are virtues for different cultures throughout time, but yeah, depending on the virtues that we're trying to we want to cultivate in society, we have to have people do service to learn what to internalize those kind of virtues. And virtue ethics actually, even though it's really old, has a lot of, I would argue, merit to it and how it's applied, because I'll get to the end, the end explanation for this to an extent. But more or less, my understanding of ethics is that no one system is formulaically able to tell you what is good and bad, but it gets even more meta and kind of I kind of feel like the system implodes, and I'll explain why. But first, I have to go over the different types of ethics. There's essentially virtue ethics. There's deontology, which is kind of a rule or duty ethics. That's Kant's, and there's other variations of Kant, and there's a bunch of different, yeah. But it comes down to consequentialism, which is the consequence is what decides whether it was good or bad, versus what's the opposite of consequentialism? Consequentialism, and I forgot the other one, but essentially it's one's deontology is focused on following the rules to achieve, and you were essentially doing what is the virtuous or the good thing. That is the good, the end good. Is there are rules within society, and you can further restrict those and make them a little more reliable by restricting them by adding a categorical imperative, if I recall. Categorical imperative is if you were to add a list of 10 commandments on top of the duty ethics to help maybe prevent it from going awry. Because if you were to just adhere to duty ethics, deontology, without a categorical imperative, then basically whatever society deems as your job, like your job role, is what technically is the good thing for you to do, even if it's like maybe doesn't feel right to you. It would be from that perspective argued being a good thing. So, and you could technically use deontology in certain warped senses as justifying the Nazis' like adherence to their morals or their whatever their ethical paradigm you want to call that they were adhering to. They were following orders, and if you just follow orders, lots of horrible things have come from just following orders. Even if the general like baseline for this or the norm for it is that following a rule is good in the majority of circumstances, there might be exotic circumstances or unusual circumstances that may make doing what would ordinarily be a good thing a bad thing. Such as in Nazi Germany, helping people was like, say an SS officer helps a Jewish person escape, they would technically be doing something that is contrary to whatever their role is as an SS officer, usually to obey authority and to like not help Jews. However, in the more like if you value humanity and empathy and whatnot, then you would kind of grasp how intuitively, it is kind of wrong to just follow orders if you just like a robot. Like humans aren't robots, and that's probably a very good thing because robots don't have morals per se. You can program them to have certain rules, but you can't have a robot usually do the same sophistication of decision making that humans can do in regards to ethics. Not that I've seen thus far. That being said, that's why the categorical imperative was added. There's a list of rules that essentially are meant to make it so that you should subscribe to these, similar, in my opinion, to 10 Commandments. And they list you, they have you go over like, you should not lie or be untruthful or whatnot, or you should not do X, Y, or Z action or behavior, rather. Even if it is in service to whatever your rule is, because the categorical imperative kind of supersedes or is more valuable and important than whatever that rules are. So there's, I guess you could say, more important rules and less important rules. But of course, I'm not a Kantian per se. So I mean, I like a lot of ideas. I think some of the formula is useful for categorical imperative, but I don't really feel like it's the case, and I don't feel like it's a robust or pragmatic system to try to implement. But good on anybody who's trying to. Then going beyond that, there's and these are usually schools divorced into two different categories that I can think of. There's the Universalist ethics. They're saying there should be one set of ethics for all of humanity. And there's like kind of relativism, which is saying like, oh, you have different rules for different people or different cultures. And that's where you can break it down into subjectivism. And this is off of like years ago. I've studied some of this stuff. But subjectivism is basically saying that there is no like objective right and wrong per se. And that basically right and wrong is relative in some way, shape, or fashion, or subjective in some way, shape, or fashion. And you could say this is relativism is usually like more at the individual level of like there's almost no like it's whatever is convenient for you as an individual. And I don't think that's a productive way of looking at ethics or how to run a society or have individuals function. Out of that, I would argue there's also the cultural variation, which is cultural relativism. Basically, whatever the culture has ascribed as good or bad is what you should subscribe to as good or bad. And of course, we have plenty of times throughout history we can look at, and cultures that we look at, that do what we would consider like from an intuitive perspective or like internally like viciously wrong things, but within the culture it could be accepted. And of course it's much more messy than that, but that's just the general gist of it. Is I don't think most people would want to subscribe to cultural relativism, because then nobody has grounds to criticize anybody else. Same thing for subjectivism, because you don't really it kind of defeats the purpose of ethics in a lot of ways. The goal is kind of I would imagine is to have a sense of what the rules should generally be, and I don't feel like that is. If people were to individually subscribe to these viewpoints, I do not feel like society would be better. That's the easy way of putting it. Then there's the Universalist ethics, and of course I might have missed some other the more relativist varieties. There's a whole bunch of species of all these things, but they boil down to these major ones. Then there's, of course, going back to Universalist ethics, which included deontology, which is about doing what is your duty and is following sincerely with that. That's where the virtuous version of that would be a soldier who does things for the sake of their country, even though they fear for their life, or they don't. It doesn't initially it's not protecting their well-being. They're putting themselves in the line of fire because it's their job to do that. That is their duty. So it can be done in a virtuous fashion, but I think can also be done in a very vicious fashion, and often can be used to excuse horrible atrocities in certain contexts that are more likely than not likely. What else is there? And of course, the opposite of deontology, or sort of the opposite, is the consequentialist. Consequentialism is the outcome is what matters, if I recall correctly. I think it is. And then that one is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is essentially the greatest good for the greatest number, which is very simple way of putting it, right? There's also a refined version of that, just like there is for deontology. Of course, the greatest good for the greatest number, if you're savvy about it and you're an evil genius, you can turn that on its head, and it depends on who counts as the greatest number, who counts as agents within the system, who gets to be a part of the moral community is what they call it often. And the moral community is basically, they're imagine for say antebellum slavery, the moral community did not include slaves by and large for slave owners in their mind, because slaves were not considered full-on people by white slave owners, right? And so this, of course, you can see if in that context it can go wrong. And of course, there's lots of ways you can spin it on its head. And so that's one way you can kind of break utilitarianism from being what would ordinarily be a pretty useful system of ethics. Another way I see a breakdown that can occur is if you have two different say you have two equal numbers of people. This is a thought experiment for me. Two equal numbers of people, and both of them do not intermix. So, I mean, you could look at it, utilitarianism, as these two warring groups of equal number, and one of them wants something that is, say there's a finite item that they both desire. Now, rather than doing what would be probably more fair and pragmatic and coming together and maybe doing a lottery or finding, there's a number of ways you could go about trying to share resources. They have no desire to share resources and will necessarily want to destroy each other. This is a thought experiment, so it's going to be restricted like that. So with this being the case, what constitutes the greatest good ends up being a lot fuzzier, in my opinion. And that's just one off the top of my head. I'm sure there's plenty of other cases, but who qualifies as being the greatest number or the moral community that you're trying to include matters a lot. And so there are situations somebody look at the thought experiment of if you had to shoot an innocent child to save millions of people, would it be good or bad, or would it be acceptable? And of course, on a couple of grounds, I would argue that utilitarianism, given that kind of trolley experiment is what they call it, where essentially a trolley experiment is you have a trolley that's going to kill, it's going to lead to two mutually bad outcomes, or both bad outcomes, and you have to basically decide whether one is better or worse than the other, even if they're both significantly terrible. And the trolley experiment is kind of used as a tool against, I think, utilitarianism in many cases. So like, oh, well, what if you had to shoot this innocent child to save millions of people? And I mean, fortunately, that those kind of dilemmas are, I think, often very rare. And if we were innovative and wise and intellectual and do our homework, I believe that we can actually mitigate the number of situations in that circumstance will arise. That being said, it does not clarify whether like it is virtuous to save the child and damn the millions of people, or save the millions of people and damn the child, so to speak, right? But yeah, it's a messy thing. I like utilitarianism a little bit more than deontology, because I just feel like intuitively more like it makes more sense regarding the fate of humanity to consider the greater number of people's well-being against just the individual. And collectivism tends to favor that as well. I mean, humans just by nature in tribes, even if we were gonna like think of ourselves as whether it be separate tribes or one major tribe, it does make a lot of sense for the success of the species. But of course, there are exotic situations and contexts that would maybe not sit well with us. Let's put it. Then, of course, we're going to go to ethical egoism, which is like, I think, it's almost relativistic in some ways, but it's arguing that it should be applied universally. So it still, I think, falls into universalist camp. And I learned all this stuff from like years ago from one of my, rest in peace to my ethics philosophy teacher, Mr. Stramel from Santa Monica College. He passed away a while back, and I wanted to do something. Hopefully I can use this video that I show it demonstrating that I learned stuff from him that's still useful to me today, years later. And hopefully it's useful to you and makes you think as well. But yeah. Next one, ethical egoism. Everybody should basically do what's in their own best interests. But of course, I personally hate ethical egoism. I think it's like the world's already full of selfish people who are like thinking in that fashion, and it's usually a warped version of that fashion. And if you have a bunch of psychopaths, even like above average number of psychopaths in society, if that's the case, and you have them working towards their rational, like what they think is their best interest, it could end up like messing up the system of humanity in lots of different ways. And like damning, I honestly kind of feel like our corporate and capitalist system has this sort of as their de facto attitude, even if it's not their formal mantra or like not written in stone somewhere outlining this is the rules for capitalism. In capitalism, I just feel like necessarily it ends up being the case that people aim for their own best interests. And this is made worse because we don't live in a educated, enlightened society as I would like to. Like the United States likes to believe it's very virtuous and ethical, but there's tons of shit throughout history and even today that's clearly questionable, if not outright wrong and vicious and cruel and doesn't need to be happening, but is happening. And it's not where we like to criticize other countries. One example of this is like the United States likes to criticize China. I'm working over in China. And I feel like it's unfair and it's unreal to go point fingers when you're not actually trying to apply a lot of these things at home. Now, I see lots of people take these things to the like some kind of absurd and try and map things on that are not analogous to one another. For example, I've heard the example of, you should apply your own principles at home within reason. Such as like used against like say Bernie Sanders, who's clearly trying to live his principles and who's like, you have to go out of your way not to see that he's a virtuous person. And it's like I've seen people try to say that Bernie Sanders, in some sense, he's motivated by greed and riches, and he's only doing all this stuff to make money. Now, I'm not saying that he's not like any human being to a real rational extent is trying to make money and survive. This is the case. However, that does not mean that he's I think Sanders is his heart is in service to humanity, not just for a paycheck. And that's why I think makes him a good senator, even if he's kind of failed us as a presidential candidate twice. So that was my little shade right there. I had to be real. But going back to our ethics, so we've gone through deontology, rules define what's right and wrong. Utilitarianism, the greater good defines what's right or wrong. And then also there's a problem within utilitarianism of defining and deciding what constitutes the greater good and how you read that out. And there's also the problem of, I believe Jeremy Bentham had attempted to create a system of, like a mathematical system to evaluate things based upon, I think they were called hedons, or basically some good is better than another type of good, which is, it's a noble effort. It's good, to think about. I think all these things are useful tools to consider and reflect on. But I don't know if any one of them is the absolute or the truth of the matter, what will give you the 100% answer in majority of cases. But I do believe that if you know all of them, that you're more likely to make the right decision ethically than somebody who only had subscribed to one of them. But of course, we don't have a way of testing that as far as I'm aware. So moving on, we've gone through deontology, utilitarianism, subjectivism, ethical egoism, cultural relativism. For each of those, deontology, rules decide what's right and wrong. Utilitarianism, outcome and greater good for the greatest good for the greatest number decides what's good or bad. Ethical egoism, you decide yourself what's good and bad based upon what is in your best interest, your rational best interest, keyword rational, a rational best interest. A lot of people I consider irrational, and I honestly think most people are only half rational at best. Cultural relativism, the culture decides what's good or bad. Subjectivism, it's up, there isn't necessarily a good or bad, and just it's whatever you want to interpret it as. And that's almost along the lines of amoralism. Amoralism is essentially that there is no good or bad. There's just there's no rules. You can almost think the Joker is kind of amoralist in spirit. The Joker doesn't seem to think there's a good or bad. Or at least as near, let's not get into comic books. It's a whole nother video. But I like using comic book characters as archetypes to understand, and I like to use different concepts to understand other concepts. So moving on. Yeah, so we've revisited all the different, a lot of different ethical paradigms, and they're divided into the two camps. Universal, everybody should follow this rule set, whatever it is, or whatever the formula is, or yeah. The other one's subjective, and basically whoever wants to interpret it however you feel bro. And so, but all of these seem to lack, I feel like they're all deficient. And the reason I feel like they're all deficient is that there are plenty of cases for any of them, some more than others, unfortunately, and fortunately, that it just creates, there are circumstances I can imagine that just horrible things would result if people blindly subscribe to them. And that scares me for humanity. So after that, and years of observing how ethics plays out via history, because if you look at history, you can I look at it Native American genocide, manifest destiny of Europeans, Spanish conquest, Spanish Inquisition, religion, what that's done to all these people, and how do these ethics play out, or how these morals and or ethics, if you want to separate them or make them the same thing, how do they play out in reality? And I honestly don't see the world isn't that ethical. It's just like I said, the world is. I feel like humans are half rational beings, or on average are only half rational at best. I feel like the same is probably the case for how ethics operates, or how to put it. I don't want to lose my train of thought, so we'll just backtrack for a second. I don't think that ethics, I'm going to distill this to the conclusion I've come to thus far. I don't think ethics, I don't think the world is ethical. There's more evidence, I think, to support that the world is, on average, not ethical, or mostly not as ethical as we would think, than ethical in the close to ideal sense. Like, I mean, we're ethical within the bounds of it is convenient for ourselves for the most part, but we're not ethical. Like, we don't, like, I don't feel like America goes out of its way to, like, undo many of the wrongs it's done. And when they do, a lot of them are, like, hella late. So I cited those, I'm back on my train of thought. I cited the examples of, like, oh, Native American genocide and Spanish Inquisition, all this terrible stuff. And what have we done realistically to make right those things that were wronged in the past? Like, the damage that was done. Even if we don't, like, have the ability, for some people, we can maybe help their descendants. And this bleeds into the concept, as a black person, I have to bring up, of reparations. And I remember there was a brilliant philosopher. What's his name? Something Boxall, Boxil. I have to look him up again. It's been a while, but Boxall was arguing that reparations are actually, like, I think it was along the lines of, who was it? It was a contract theorist, I believe. Don't want to lose train of thought. More important is that Boxall was arguing that whether you want to look at reparations as remedying a past wrong or restoring equity, so a balanced playing field, you should do the reparations. This is what it distills to. I'm going to just save you the time on reading the paper. You should read the paper, but he wrote this paper about, like, using one of the founding fathers as a model for like, why there should be reparations, especially for black people, but for all people in general. We want Native Americans and everybody else to be integrated and have a fair chance in society. And as things stand, it's as if there was a race and certain people have been had weights added to their legs or been not allowed to leave before certain other groups of people. And this goes across this, whether it's men, like, if you want to, like, distill the race by demographics, the ones who are overwhelmingly pushed towards the front are usually older white males. Usually. Not only. So, and then you can break that down. Of course, tends to be a little bit older people prospering in society, have an advantage. Euro-American or European, because of conquest and colonialism and imperialism and warping the international zeitgeist to their attitudes about how the world should operate. That's why I argue that the world is actually largely run on capitalism. Even if you have a socialist country within a capitalist international bubble or economy only can insulate, like, so much from the, like, can only insulate the country from so much of the capitalism, because they still have to survive within the capitalist nation or capitalist overarching international economy, capitalist dominated overarching international community. And so if we want to, like, even if, like, getting the United States to be socialist, we would also have to, like, rewrite a lot, or, like, set the standard again for what is cool on the international level by example through socialist policy that we think is productive and life-affirming and humanistic, or whatever you want to call it, the good shit. And that goes back to what I was thinking about for my own understanding of ethics, is that as things stand, they're actually, on the meta level, on the ultimate level, we don't live in a fully ethical society or world, and that's whether that's the United States or you want to look at the global community in general. It's just like we care about shit sometimes, and I mean it's just part of the difficulty of life in general, because we don't have an equitable world. But I want to go a step further and say that we can't have an ethical society, or can't have an ethical world in the true sense of the way I'm saying it, like, in the truest sense of it. I don't believe we can have an ethical world without, I mean, we cannot have a just world or ethical world without having an equitable world, or establishing equity amongst different groups of disadvantaged people, whether that be Native Americans, women, LGBTQ people, and of course across all the intersections of these groups. So of course there's maybe a queer black woman, or like like a gay Native American male. I mean, it could be any series because we're a collection of these things, and that's something I should probably write or talk more about in another video regarding the my understanding of intersectionality and what I think it means. I should write that down. But intersectional. Okay. But generally speaking, some people had an advantage and some people did not. And this has gone over time. And so even though they might have fixed some of the rules so that now the other people can have a chance, the other people who have had the advantage have been in the lead for so long that it's almost like even if you do these things, they can only catch up so much. And it's almost, I would argue, it comes off like a lot of, like, for example, European Americans don't seem to want other groups of people to have equal rights or equity, so to speak. They don't want them to have the same ability to fight back. Because obvious example of this, I would think, is like the over policing of, say, black people. I want to be specific and do something I'm a part of over policing of black people in the United States versus, like, say, Euro Americans. And of course, police brutalize lots of different people across intersectionality, but they're disproportionately people of color. Why do they prey upon these people? Now, I've seen the bullshit argument, and I'm calling it a bullshit argument because I think it's disingenuous, is that, oh, well, black people just commit more crimes or something, or some bullshit like that. But that's also not right. I can probably find all sorts of evidence to support why that is not the case. But rather than get bogged down by these arguments that I know are bullshit, I'm trying to stay on point here. It's not that black people are robbing people at a larger rate or larger number than white people per se. One, there's just less black people than there are white people. So proportionally, I mean, it would seem like also that implies that you have a almost racist argument and saying that so black people are suddenly more violent or something than white people innately. And rather than looking at it as a thing that's innate, somehow genetic or like a biological element to it, it's actually, in my opinion, and much more substantially you can support this, is that it's a byproduct of an environment that has been created over time by a system that is prejudiced against these people. So, of course, it's a pragmatic argument here. If you take a group of people, they don't have to all be black. It could be anybody, technically. Any group of uniform people for the most part. And you alienate them over generations and only start to give them some rights, but you don't let them be full, you don't give them full equity beyond things in writing. And it's nice to have laws, but if laws aren't being fairly or evenly applied, then you kind of don't have the laws to begin with. They don't mean anything. And so this is what I'm trying to essentially get at, is that we do not have an ethical country in the United States, because we can't have an ethical country, and because we have a capitalist dynamic to our society. It's it's increasingly and aggressively capitalist in mentality, and it's eroding what little moral and ethical values we've had and built up and maintained up to this point. Because I feel like ethics is a thing people have to work towards, distilling over time, right? So it wasn't like somebody magically was like, oh, courage, that is definitely scientifically a great thing to add to the list of ethics or good and bad qualities. Or killing is a bad thing, is definitely to add to the list of not to do things, right? I mean, these are things we kind of come to through kind of our human experience and intuition, and also usually from previous generations, we learn from the history, and oftentimes a lot of people are still influenced by religion, and religion can be all over the place on some of these same issues. So, yeah, I don't like using religion as the moral compass unless it is drawn into secular reality. it's okay to have a 10 commandments, but if you enforce 10 commandments, there's lots of inconsistencies, I would argue, within application of the 10 commandments and how you interpret matters. Interpreting the context for these things makes a huge world of difference. And I can interpret, like, say you have an unjust law, but if you have a good judge, they will be able to interpret the law in a way that is least destructive to the society. That is what we would ideally want for our own society, in any society, right? But there is the case that I feel like we have maybe not unjust laws in every instance. We have, in the United States, I think many of the laws are like acceptable. Not all of them, maybe not even most, perhaps. Maybe slightly over half are not great. But we can say that a lot of laws in the United States are good, but I would argue the enforcement of these laws are unjust in a lot of cases. And they're not taking into consideration the social and economic inequities. Some black people, for example, going back to black people as an example, they don't have the resources to fight in court as effectively as European Americans. So, of course, if they're going to be if the police are going to brutalize anybody, who do you think they're going to brutalize? They're going to brutalize the people they think they can get away with brutalizing, and that's unfortunately what kind of underlies a lot of our how this plays out. Why there are more black people in prison than there are Euro-Americans, and why our system is designed in a racist fashion, because it will continue to produce these results. It perpetuates these results, and only through great sacrifice and trying to go beyond the existing system have we been able to make any significant progress. Hence the civil rights movement. Many people had to die and be beaten and tortured and lynched just to be able to get some of the rights that we should have been had from the very beginning of the country. And the United States, unlike China, is supposed to be a democracy or a democratic republic. That which still implies that there's a level of democracy. We choose our representatives, and our representatives are supposed to work in our interests. But what happens when those representatives are working against the human rights of another group of people? And that's why I have to keep going back to, like, we're not a very ethical country, and our world is actually just a bigger macroscopic version of what's going on in our country. You can see, I was looking, for example, I'll try to give this short anecdote. I was interested in learning about the Rohingya people of Myanmar, which is like not far from here. I mean, it's sort of far, but it's like not that far from China. And they're a Buddhist country. Buddhism, is like the main goal of Buddhism. Buddhism is to try and eliminate suffering. Now you can look at Buddhism as like a spiritual practice or religion or philosophy. I tend to lean towards the very first and the last of those 2 points. I think of it in more philosophical terms. And also more of a spiritual source of fortitude. But the goal of Buddhism is to try and minimize suffering. The people of Myanmar were screwed over. In learning about the Rohingya people, I've had to find out why they were being discriminated against. And it boils down to a similar outcome as happened with Pakistan and India. Basically, Britain screwed up came in, colonialized, divided and antagonized, and it was like, I got all the stuff I need, peace out. And the people didn't want them there to begin with, and they also sowed the seeds of dissent and division between people who were there for since the country, who settled that land, that are for all intents and purposes indigenous to that region, and they've set them up on each other. So during this time, Britain had a favoritism of a particular group that were Indian and Indian looking people, maybe not conventionally Indian, but other Indian people or people from that region that share similar phenotypes. Rohingya were amongst these groups, and a lot of them end up being Muslim as well. Given the current social circumstances, I saw how that kind of led that was suggested to be a factor in driving some of the Asian, more Southeast Asian population of the non-Indian population of Myanmar against this group of people. But it wasn't only that. Of course, there's a religious divide because they also have division between Buddhists and a lot of them are Muslim. Not only Muslim, there's also Hindu, but there's a stronger division presently on religion ground between Buddhism and maybe Hinduism and Islam, then would be ideal. And of course, these things are only exacerbated by the problem of poverty and lack of education, which are necessarily go to hand, just like. And this goes back to why I'm so frustrated by the United States embracing a capitalist solution and system. Essentially, we have enough history to see how these things continue to play out, but I feel like we're kind of like there's like willful ignorance, not even an accidental ignorance within the United States. Like they're consciously just doing the wrong thing, and some people are just like don't feel like bothering to think about it. So that's why I'm here. So I also ended up seeing how that ended up in turn affecting many women in Myanmar, and this went beyond just the Rohingya people. Many women in Myanmar, from what I've heard about thus far. I don't want to make too many I won't make absolute claims because I have not been able to visit there myself, and also I want to be on reasonably decent diplomatic grounds here. But a lot of women have voiced complaints and about sexism and criticisms of a patriarchal system that prejudices and exploits the women there. But again, this is a byproduct of a capitalist system at the international level, and then also a byproduct of the colonialism and imperialism of the past by Britain, who were like, go and destabilize the country, like take its resources or whatever you could get out of it, and then like bounce when you can't enslave the population anymore. And the United States does this too. You can even say that some of our colonies include Puerto Rico and Guam, and we used to have the Philippines for a while too. But we've taught this method of attaining power to other countries, and they've actually I would argue to some extent that World War II was actually a byproduct of that kind of methodology. This colonial imperialist attitude was adopted because it was the way to avoid being colonized. If you're also an empire, you're less likely to be colonized than a country that is not organized, basically. And I see a parallel between at the micro level between organizing groups against for political movements to resolve problems within society. Again, you're going to be messed with less if you were a part of a organized and powerful group, or in this case, evil corporation sometimes, or not necessarily evil always, but I would argue most corporations kind of are evil, or amoral, because their duty and their legal fiduciary duty is to their shareholders and no one else, not the environment, not to their workers, just their shareholders. And so that's, in my opinion, unethical and immoral. And we, in a more functioning system, not necessarily a full-on socialist system, but I would argue a socialist system would be able to would take the attitude of trying to address this rather than having to back and forth as much. Because capitalism will half fix the problem, but they'll leave it open, they'll be vulnerable enough for a long enough period where the people who have resources and powers that they were trying to stop will come in and try and undo the shit that they did before to for example, workers' rights, or paid sick leave, or pensions, or social security. There are people who, super rich and selfish people who want to get rid of these things that most people count on, that will never probably be rich, and who are necessarily at disadvantage for the sake of the rich people. So, oh my god, I'm at 43 minutes. So, I'm going to see if I'm missing anything. I think I touched on the majority of this, and I'm trying to link the different concepts together because I want everybody to see how essentially a system of capitalism, which is aimed towards profit, does not have an ethical paradigm beyond the acquisition of profit by whatever means is legally permissible and sometimes illegally permissible. And if you have the resources and power enough, you can reshape the laws so that it will be legal to do what would be considered unethical and amoral or immoral things. So yeah, I think I'm going to conclude on that note. I don't think I missed anything. Yeah. Basically, capitalism isn't moral. It's not ethical. And I don't think it can be in any enduring sense. So That's why our society should be aimed towards socialism rather than capitalism on an economic level and a political level, because socialism is at least aimed towards the social well-being and health, and capitalism is just geared towards whatever makes the people with capital more money. And it doesn't care who that group is. It doesn't care if it's fair or not. It just does what it does. So yeah, I'm going to conclude there. Thank you for your time. Hopefully it's made you think. And please add comments. I'll do my best to keep up with you and correspond. I wanted to make this more official and like cleaned up everything. I'd rather have edited videos, but I just don't have the time to really edit videos like I would like to. And just like life keeps happening. So I have to distill as much as I can to everybody the best I'm able to. I'm at least starting to structure them again. So bear with me as I slowly start to have hopefully increasingly more structured, presentable package for you guys to understand. Thank you for your time, and see you next time. Peace.